Hey everybody, Mr. Fantini here, and welcome to our final video on F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. We've got through 8 out of 9 chapters, and we're going to get started on the very last one today. The last chapter, chapter 8, was a tough one for us. In our last video, we read the first chunk of the chapter together, where Nick and Gatsby kind of had their heart-to-heart late-night conversation into early morning, where Gatsby revealed his mysterious past, and together they tried to think about what he could do, how he can move forward in light of all the horrible events, both him missing out on his dream of being with Daisy, but also the fact that he was in the passenger seat when Daisy hit Myrtle with his car last night. Nick really encourages him to get up and get out of New York while the getting is good, because he's afraid that the police are going to track down his car. But Gatsby says that he can't bring himself to do that because he expects that Daisy's going to call later on. So he'll risk getting taken away to jail if it means that he won't miss the call from Daisy that he thinks is coming later that afternoon. They have a really kind of friendly, sincere departure as Nick leaves to go to work. Nick kind of gives him this like benediction. He kind of says that you're better than all of them put together, and Gatsby gives him one last big smile as Nick goes off to work, and Gatsby goes off to take a swim in his swimming pool, which he has not used once all season. And that's sort of the last high point in this novel, because what comes next is a very kind of like detached, reporterly, clinical, matter-of-factly description of Myrtle's husband George coming to a bizarre realization and taking a gun, walking all the way to West Egg, and shooting Gatsby dead in his swimming pool before taking his own life. And it's in the aftermath of that sort of traumatic and tragic event that chapter 9 begins. And Nick, of all people, is kind of left to pick up the pieces, as always, because other people's problems always fall in his lap. So it's only appropriate that he has to deal with this one too. So as we open up to chapter 9, we're going to skip ahead just about a page and a half before we get started, just because there's a couple long paragraphs there that kind of describe the newspapers going nuts with this story about Gatsby. Remember, he had kind of been in the news as this kind of like potentially sketchy figure out on Long Island. And, after he's killed in a murder-suicide of this man from the Valley of the Ashes, all the newspapers go nuts, assuming that, it was him who was having an affair with George's wife. And they kind of like drag his name through the mud now that he's not there to speak up for himself. And then it kind of falls to Nick, strangely enough, to put together Gatsby's funeral. And that's where we're going to jump in right here in the paragraph that starts up, "I called up Daisy half an hour after we found him." So this is as he's starting to kind of like make the arrangements and reach out to people who he knows cared about Gatsby, right? "I called up Daisy half an hour after we found him, called her instinctively and without hesitation. But she and Tom had gone away early that afternoon and taken baggage with them. Left no address? No. Say when they'd be back? No. Any idea where they are? How I could reach them? Don't know. Can't say. I wanted to get somebody for him. I wanted to go into the room where he lay and reassure him. I'll get somebody for you, Gatsby. Don't worry. Just trust me, and I'll get somebody for you." So he knows that, it's ceremony. It's like closure to a person's life to bring the people who cared about them to the body to kind of observe and pay their respects. First thought, Daisy, of course, the most important person in Gatsby's life. But she and Tom have skipped town, taken their stuff with them, left no address, obviously because Daisy just killed someone last night, right? So they skip out before they can be held accountable for that. Meyer Wolfsheim, remember Gatsby's kind of shady criminal associate, Meyer Wolfsheim's name wasn't in the phone book. The butler gave me his office address on Broadway, and I called information, but by the time I had the number, it was long after 5 and no one answered the phone. Will you ring again? I've rung them 3 times. It's very important. I'm sorry, I'm afraid there's no one there. I went back to the drawing room and thought for an instant that they were chance visitors, all these official people who suddenly filled it. But as they drew back the sheet and looked at Gatsby with unmoving eyes, his protest continued in my brain. Look here, old sport. You've got to get somebody for me. You've got to try hard. I can't go through this alone. That's sort of Gatsby's voice in the back of Nick's head. He wants to do right by his friend. Someone started to ask me questions, but I broke away and going upstairs looked hastily through the unlocked parts of his desk. He never told me definitively that his parents were dead, but there was nothing, only the picture of Dan Cody, a token of forgotten violence staring down from the wall. The next morning I sent the butler to New York with a letter to Wolfsheim, which asked for information and urged him to come out on the next train. That request seemed superfluous when I wrote it. I was sure he'd start when he saw the newspapers, just as I was sure there'd be a wire from Daisy before noon. But neither a wire nor Mr. Wolfsheim arrived. No one arrived, except more police and photographers and newspapermen. When the butler brought back Wolfsheim's answer, I began to have a feeling of defiance, of scornful solidarity between Gatsby and me against them all. And here's Wolfsheim's letter back to Nick after he reaches out to him a couple times. Dear Mr. Carraway, this has been one of the most terrible shocks of my life. To me, I hardly can believe that it was true at all. Such a mad act as that man did should make us all think. I cannot come down now as I am tied up in some very important business and cannot get mixed up in this thing right now. If there is anything I can do a little later, let me know in a letter by Edgar. I hardly know where I am when I hear about a thing like this, and am completely knocked down and out. Yours truly, Meyer Wolfsheim. And then a hasty addenda beneath. Let me know about the funeral, etc. Do not know his family at all. So Nick's made 2 attempts to reach out to someone to come and, be with Gatsby, be with the body, be there for the funeral. Daisy, skip town, looking after her own skin. Meyer Wolfsheim, his one true friend that we know. Sorry, too busy, can't be associated. He writes some nice things like, oh, I was totally taken aback when I learned about this, but ultimately what's his answer? No, can't get involved. When the phone rang that afternoon and long distance said Chicago was calling, I thought that this would be Daisy at last, but the connection came through as a man's voice, very thin and far away. This is Slagle speaking. Yes, the name was unfamiliar. Hell of a note, isn't it? Get my wire? There haven't been any wires. Young Park's in trouble, he said rapidly. They picked him up as he handed the bonds over the counter. They got a circular from New York giving them the numbers just 5 minutes before. What do you know about that, hey? You never can tell in these hick towns. Hello? I interrupted breathlessly. Look here, this isn't Mr. Gatsby. Mr. Gatsby's dead. There was a long silence on the other end of the wire, followed by an exclamation, and then a quick squawk as the connection was broken. So a shady, seemingly criminal call from some other associate in Chicago who, as soon as he hears Gatsby's dead, what does he do? Hangs up. Not too different from Gatsby's real friends, turns out. We're going to skip ahead a little bit together. The next section here, Gatsby's dad shows up. He reads about the death of Gatsby that was picked up in a Chicago newspaper. He takes the train all the way in from Minnesota and is astounded at the state of Gatsby's home. I mean, the last time he saw his son, he left home penniless, and now look what he's made for himself. And this is kind of one of the few really human, kind of like touchingly sincere parts of this otherwise very grim, very cynical final chapter, which is, despite Gatsby's kind of like tarnished reputation among New York high society, his father is just so proud of him that he's made something of himself. What he's made of himself is up for debate, whether it's a value or not, but just the mere fact that he's been able to purchase this gigantic home out east in New York City, his dad is sort of like heartbroken and fawning over what his son was able to do with his life. So skipping ahead just a little bit here. Let's see. Let's go to the next phone call that Nick has to field here. This is the bottom the bottom of the page in the paragraph that starts, that night, an obviously frightened person called up. Okay. That night, an obviously frightened person called up and demanded to know who I was before he would give his name. This is Mr. Carraway, I said. Oh, he sounded relieved. This is Klipspringer. I was relieved, too, for that seemed to promise another friend at Gatsby's grave. I didn't want it to be in the papers and draw a sightseeing crowd, so I'd been calling up a few people myself, but they were hard to find. The funeral's tomorrow, I said. 3 o'clock here at the house. I wish you'd tell anybody who'd be interested. Oh, I will, he broke out hastily. Of course, I'm not likely to see anybody, but if I do... His tone made me suspicious. So he's immediately, as soon as he hears that the funeral's tomorrow, he starts doing that thing where he's like, oh yeah, that would be great, but I don't know if I'm gonna see anyone. I don't know. Like, Nick can already tell that he's trying to weasel his way out of showing up at Gatsby's funeral. And by the way, remember Clipspringer? He's the guy who lived in Gatsby's house the entire summer. Went to all his parties, ate all his food, drank all his wine, didn't pay him any rent. Gatsby was just like, oh yeah, we got an extra room upstairs. Go ahead, stay up there. And this is the one who's now starting to weasel out of this. Of course you'll make it there. You'll be there yourself. Well, certainly I'll try. Well, what I called up about is, wait a minute, I interrupted. How about saying you'll come? Well, the fact is that the truth of the matter is that I'm staying with some people up here in Greenwich, and they'd rather expect me to be with them tomorrow. And in fact, there's a sort of a picnic or something. Of course, I'll do my very best to get away. I ejaculated an unrestrained, huh, and he must have heard me, for he went on nervously. Well, what I called up about was a pair of shoes I left there. I wonder if it'd be too much trouble to have the butler send them on. You see, they're tennis shoes, and I'm sort of helpless without them. My address is care of B.F. I didn't hear the rest of the name because I hung up the receiver. After that, I felt a certain shame for Gatsby. One gentleman to whom I telephoned implied that he had got what he deserved. However, that was my fault, for he was one of those who used to sneer most bitterly at Gatsby on the courage of Gatsby's liquor, and I should have known better than to call him. So, even Clipspringer, the guy who Gatsby literally let live in his house and took care of him, room and board, don't worry about it, can't come to Gatsby's funeral because he has to go to a picnic or something. And then after saying that he's not going to come to Gatsby's funeral, says, oh, well, but it'd be really nice if you could get the butler to mail me my tennis shoes. I really need them for this weekend. And then the next person Nick calls says that Gatsby got what was coming to him. Although, his disapproval of Gatsby didn't stop him from coming to Gatsby's parties and partaking in his food and his liquor. So this is really interesting to compare this with what we saw of Gatsby in chapter 3, right? The very first thing that we learn about Gatsby is he's this person with all these friends, right? He throws parties every weekend. House is full. People come from all over the city, all over the state. They go to Gatsby's parties. They have a great time. They dance, they sing, they do this whole thing. And all these people who might have been his friends, at least friendly enough to show up to his house and eat his food and drink his liquor, can't be bothered to show up to his funeral. And Nick will try a couple more names to try to get them out to his funeral, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's a pretty scantily attended affair, as you'll see. Go ahead and keep on reading from there. Pour one out for Gatsby, I guess. And really focus in on that very last section, because there's going to be a break. We get Gatsby's funeral, and then there's a break where Nick kind of talks about a couple things that happened to him after this whole affair ends. He runs into Tom, and then he has a very iconic meditation on the nature of life and the future and the past. And that's those last couple sentences of this book are very, very famous. So I hope that you pay extra attention to them and read them and enjoy them, okay? So you're almost at the end, just got a couple pages left. Keep on reading, finish strong, and I hope that you're all staying healthy and staying safe and, being kind to those that you love and taking care of those around you, okay? I look forward to talking to you about the rest of the last chapter, and I'll see you soon, okay? Take care.